Okay, so when we think about morality today, right, we often think in terms of rights and duties, right? That I have certain rights that I can expect others to recognize, and I have certain duties to others in society and to society itself. This language around rights and duties is really something that shows up in the modern world, right? Beginning when I say modern world, I'm talking like, maybe 16th, 17th centuries, and really gets going with a group of philosophers, largely political philosophers that were developed ideas around social contract theory, right? And so the ideas, the sort of notion of social contract, um, um, kind of give us this language which we're incredibly familiar with, and and this is a shift from what we had been talking about, or kind of the approach, right, that the ancient philosophers uh, kind of looked at the world from, right? They didn't talk in quite this language of rights and duties that we talk in, and so we're going to be looking at the development of this language that is our language, right? The way we understand society and the way we understand our relationship with others within society. So we're going to kind of move into that discussion. This will give us a chance to really talk about law, right, and the relationship between morality, ethics, and the law. Um, this relationship is very interesting because the law is a normative system in the same way that ethics is a normative system, or a normative way of approaching reality. Meaning, right, it's something that tells us how we should act, what we should do, and how we should act. And so social contract theory, right, kind of takes this question of law quite seriously, right? It says that this is, the law is really the kind of the glue that holds society together, that we enter into this kind of relationship under the social contract, and then we have certain responsibilities and duties that arise because of that, because of that agreement, because we're entering into this commonwealth. This sort of notion of that's what creates the glue, I think, is really kind of what separates, or what sort of characterizes this approach, and what makes this very modern in a certain way. The ancient philosophers, looking at Aristotle in particular, were largely what we would consider to be communitarian. And when I say communitarian, right, what I mean here is the view is that society, right, we as social sort of creatures, right, society is first, right, it's primary, right, the social is primary, and that individuals, yes, like, arise out of that, right, and they have an important place sort of out of that, but there are social first. The society is first, and individuals sort of arise from and are understood only within the context of the social, within the context of society, right? So that's the communitarian view. We'll look at that a little bit more when we look at natural law and civil disobedience, particularly when we look at Thomas Aquinas, right? Because Thomas Aquinas develops a very communitarian sort of view, and grounded in Aristotle, and as well as in his religious sort of approach. So we will spend a bit more time with that, but this sort of modern approach is usually begins with the individual, right? That we are individuals. We are individuals with certain rights, and that we come together, in the social contract or in the commonwealth or whatever, right, through the law, but we come together to form a society, right? So we're individuals first, forming a society, right? So do different views, and I'm not saying that the communitarian view is like sort of gone completely out, right? But certainly there was a shift particularly in this sort of early modern period towards this more sort of individual focused understanding of society, right? And a sort of approach that was not kind of even on the radar of the ancient kind of approach. So we get that change, and with it, right, this language that we tend to use around rights, liberties, duties, and so on. Sort of contract, social contract, commonwealth, right? All of these sorts of words that we use to understand this sort of process and our sort of moral relationships with one another. And so this sort of connection between law and morality will be important to think about. And we'll look at it in this context as well as in this sort of context of natural law and civil disobedience as well. So it also will let us talk about the Enlightenment too, right? And so the development of the Enlightenment and how that changed the way we think, and the use of reason in our sort of modern understanding of what reason is really begins to show up at this point as well. So I'm going to start, and I'll show the screen here, and we'll start with kind of a look at how some of these sort of questions and ideas were discussed in kind of earlier figures, and then how they continue to be dealt with today. So first of all, the sort of general relationship between law and morality, and then we'll look at social contract theory with our primarily paying attention to Hobbes, not because he necessarily develops the most robust theory, but because he really gets this conversation going in his work, the Leviathan. And then we'll spend some time talking about Locke and Rousseau. So kind of the general theme here, right? Law, justice, and the good, right? What is justice? How does it relate to the law? How does it relate to the good? So language, right, of course, that Plato would be familiar with. And there are two kind of ways, I think, that show up in thinking about this relationship between morality and the law, right? One of them that I've been talking about is that we have rights or liberties that serve as both a source and a constraint on the law, right? That I have a certain right. I have a right, to my property, for example, and that becomes a certain sort of source of law, right? The law is there to protect me in my property. It also becomes a constraint on the law, right? The law cannot sort of interfere with my enjoyment with the property unless there's some other right that needs to be protected. And so the sort of notion of rights, right, becomes this source, right, and our notion of duties, our moral duties, insofar as they are sort of contained within that, right, become a sort of a respect of those rights of others, right, and so largely these sort of negative kind of rights of not being harmed by others. The other sort of strand and is sort of presented to us by natural law theory, right, where morality is a source and constraint of law, right? And so kind of morality becomes in this tradition, right, becomes sort of the backdrop from which, like, the law arises from. And of course we have a number of laws that sort of focus on this. Maybe one of the sort of least sort of controversial, here you might think of like even like traffic safety laws, sort of in the backdrop here, right? And so we have this sort of notion of morality that can sort of be in the backdrop, and then laws arising out of that. And natural law theory, right? It really says like a law that does not sort of adhere to some sort of moral grounding is not a legitimate law. And I think that what you would find if you kind of look through the law, right? I think what you would find is you would find a mixture of both of these, right? You would find a mixture of both law that is sort of grounded in social contract and law that is grounded in some sort of natural law. And you know, I think that both of these traditions are important if we're sort of paying attention to how the law has developed. So we'll be looking at kind of both of these sides separately. So I want to sort of go through some of these older figures, so Plato and others, and see where some of these ideas did in fact arise or were dealt with fairly early. So an example here with Plato is in the Crito, and if you're sort of looking at the sort of the history here that he's presenting, or the biography or whatever of Socrates, right? This shows up after the Apology, but before the Phaedo, which is the death scene, right? So this is when Socrates is sitting in jail. He's got a friend that comes and is trying to kind of break him out of jail, saying like, you got to leave, right? It's unjust that they have condemned you to death. You know, you need to leave before the execution, essentially. And Socrates sort of gives the argument in the Crito, again, presented by or written by Plato, but this is one of the Socratic dialogues. And so Socrates gives this sort of argument that hey, like the law has supported me, right? The state has supported me. Athens has supported my entire life. And I owe a duty to the state to comply with its commands, even if they are unjust. Right. So, and I think the real focus here is like when they are unjust in the sort of way where the harm is only coming upon me, right? I've received the goods from the state, right? And now I can't sit and complain, oh, well, now the law is not treating me well, and so I can't comply. I think this is a different question if we were talking about harm to someone else, right? If it was sort of requiring that I perform some act, right, that I find to be unjust to someone else, I think this question might be a little bit different. But in the Crito, right, it's really only focused on this one particular type of situation, and so he says, like, you know, part of kind of my role here, right, is that I kind of stood up for what I thought was right. The state, you know, through this sort of jury condemning me, has found, right, that it needs to execute me, right, and so I must comply with that command, right? I can't run away. Okay, so really, you know, kind of an early expression of social contract type theory, fairly consistent with some of what we'll talk about with Hobbes, although maybe not perfectly. The Republic, which is a Platonic dialogue, so this is certainly Plato operating here, but in the Republic, Plato says that justice requires that I follow virtue, period, right? Even if the command of the sovereign says that I do otherwise, right? So the power, the command of the sovereign, right, cannot overrun my moral commitments, right? Justice cannot overrun justice, right? Justice is more sort of important than the commands of the sovereign, right? So this is moving in much more the direction of like natural law. So Aristotle developed a more sort of thorough investigation of the question of justice, and he sort of sees justice as operating in both of these ways, right? That we have kind of lawfulness, right? What he calls general justice, lawfulness, which includes like not just kind of the legal system as such, right? But customs that people follow. And then we have this notion of specific justice, which is a form of fairness, right? Or that people get what they deserve, right? And so this notion of fairness shows up here. So we don't need to get, kind of deep into this discussion right now. But he does say that specific justice is necessary for general justice, right? So we can't have general justice without fairness, right? So the law can't kind of step outside of basic fairness. But general justice, right, can be different depending on kind of the state or the community. There's different forms of this justice, right? Distributive justice. So interestingly, that Aristotle says that with distributive justice, the most fair distribution of resources and responsibilities and so on is that the most virtuous, right? Those with the most virtue should receive the greatest share of resources. And I think that there's a practical reason for Aristotle that those who are most virtuous are the best able to distribute those or use those in a way that's beneficial to society, right? Corrective justice, right? This is both the kind of what we would think of as criminal law, but would also be both sort of contract and tort law, where if some harm has occurred, right, corrective justice ensures that those who cause the harm repay in some way. And then the justice of reciprocity, right, is of course related to this. So that's Aristotle. So he's, again, he kind of recognizes something kind of like the social contract idea, but also kind of retains this notion of fairness as having to as a sort of constraint on the law. So jumping way ahead, right, into the modern period and the Enlightenment, we can think of the Enlightenment here as an important sort of questioning of authority, right? Like that's one way of understanding the Enlightenment. That the Enlightenment sort of questions all authorities except for the authority of reason, right? Reason or morality or sort of scientific observation and theory, right? And so in science and in philosophy, right, the authorities of the past were questioned, which what this meant is the authorities of the ancient world were questioned. Before the Enlightenment, to be a philosopher, to be a scientist meant to consult sort of ancient sources, right, or medieval sources as authorities on issues, right, rather than sort of going out and kind of observing and trying to kind of make sense of the world directly through experimentation, observation, and so on. Also sort of questioned, of course, were sort of politics, the political systems, religion, economic institutions, and authorities, right? All these things sort of came under critique during the Enlightenment. And of course, we see during this period, in politics, right, we see revolutions, right? We see the American Revolution, we see the French Revolution, and we see other sort of major conflicts that are going on throughout Europe, right? And so it's really a time of sort of questioning the older assumptions and asserting new sort of ideas, right? So we get this sort of experimentation in the world of science. We also get in the world of law and the world of politics, and in the world of morality, as we'll see when we talk about Kant, for example. And one of those things that's questioned, right, is this notion of divine right. So many had sort of had kind of founded, right, their legitimacy. Rulers have founded their legitimacy on this idea of divine right, in which a monarch said, hey, we are we are legitimate, right? We are the proper rulers of this society, of this community, of this nation, whatever, right? Because God has said so, right? We are sanctioned by God, and so, you know, during the Enlightenment and just preceding the Enlightenment, we begin to see significant questioning of these ideas. Not to say that, you know, kind of that was the first questioning of these ideas, as I mentioned here, right? Aquinas talks about this too in his appeal to natural law, that there is a situation in which a sovereign could be legitimately overthrown. But this idea becomes much more prevalent again with the social contract theorists. And so if we question this, right? So if the idea that the state is not grounded in some sort of divine right, or excuse me, the sovereign's authority, right? The king's authority or the queen's authority is not grounded in some sort of divine right. The question is, well, what is it grounded in then, right? How is power of the sovereign justified, right? Where does it come from? And so this is the question that Hobbes, right, in the Leviathan, this comes from the front piece of the Leviathan, that's what he is asking. And we see this, you know, kind of here we see, you know, this sort of showing up in a very dramatic sort of display. If you haven't seen this before, right, this is a painting by the French painter David, the neoclassical painter, and this is the coronation of Napoleon and Josephine, in which Napoleon sort of famously said, "Fine, you know, I'll go through the coronation ceremony." But kind of at that coronation ceremony, what does he do? He takes the crown from the Pope and says, "Oh, don't worry, I've got this, right? I'll take care of this. I'll crown myself and I'll crown Josephine." And so kind of removes any sort of you know, goes through the ceremony, right? But removes the role of the church, and through sort of, and using this as a symbol to remove the idea that Napoleon's kind of reign arises from God, right? But rather arises from the sort of the power and the sort of internal legitimacy that Napoleon saw himself sort of embodying, right? He saw himself as an Enlightenment figure, right? That you know, he's kind of the rational heir to the French Revolution and so on, right? And so he sort of presents this in this very symbolic sort of way. Okay, so social contract theory, right? Like, but what does it have to say? So we'll move to a discussion here, primarily again of Hobbes, but just to sort of ground it in language that, of course, you know, you may be, you know, very familiar with, right? In the American Declaration of Independence. Because the language of social contract theory all shows up here, right? So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? So this notion of all are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, right? So we have certain rights that cannot be taken away. And that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And so we have Jefferson here sort of identifying certain rights that are unalienable. Of course, not saying that these are all of our rights, right? But among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That secure these rights, right? So the purpose of government, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. And so the reason we have government is to ensure that our unalienable rights are protected, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So where does the sovereign, right, get its power from? The sovereign gets its power from the people, right, from the governed. that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Right? And so if a government, if the sovereign is not protecting those rights, the people have the right to abolish that government and create a new government, institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety, right? Again, we get another purpose of government, and happiness, right? So governments are there to provide for safety, right? This is very classically Hobbesian, and happiness, and we might see a little bit of Rousseau showing up in that. And so I just present that to so we can see as we sort of move through Hobbes and the other social contract theorists where this kind of language comes from. Okay, so Hobbes and social contract theory. So Hobbes is very you know, I mean, he tries to kind of break everything down, strip everything down to kind of its very basic elements, and he begins from a materialist starting point. He's what we call a strict materialist. And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that for Hobbes, right, everything in the world, right, everything in the universe, including us as human beings, is just matter in motion, right? Think of the Epicureans. He's going to have a very different view of human nature than the Epicureans, but that's the way he sees his materialist sort of worldview. Matter in motion, everything's cause and effect, everything's fully deterministic, right? Billiard balls being bumped up against one another, right? Everything in the universe is that way, including us. And the way that plays out for us, for Hobbes, right, is that we are sort of after our own desires, our own interests, right? We are exclusively and necessarily self-interested for Hobbes, right? That's how this natural determinism plays out for the human being, that we go after what we want, we push away what we don't want, we're reverse to, right? And this explains everything, right? This is the whole sort of story. Okay, so he begins with this assumption about human nature, right? That we are, and I want to be careful here because like we can use the word self-interest, and you know, I think most would recognize that, yeah, humans are self-interested, right? But we are exclusively and necessarily self-interested, right? That's it for Hobbes. Like, that's the only thing that drives us is our self-interest. And so our morality within the state of nature, and we're talking here about the state of nature, right? Our morality in the state of nature is just a morality of considering that those things which we like to be good and those things we don't like to be bad. It's completely subjective, right? It's all based on taste, and so it's just how I feel about things. We're going to get another level of morality when we move into the social contract, but in the state of nature, right? This is all we have. This doesn't go away in under the social contract, right? We still kind of see things in this way, but this is all we have in the state of nature. Also, we are rational, right? So humans are rational beings. We have the ability to use our reason instrumentally, right, to get what we want, to get what we need. It doesn't provide us with some sort of end, right? It doesn't tell us what's good, right? But it helps us get what we take to be good. So based on this, right, based on kind of this human nature, based on this sort of reality, right, we can kind of ask what the state of nature is, right, for human beings. So in this sort of state of nature, we are rational, right? We're egotistical. We're rational, egotistical, and so we can think about like what those two things sort of coming together results in, right? What it gives us in the end. Again, this is in the state of nature. And when I say state of nature, what I mean is we don't have any legal or sort of governmental constraints on our behavior, right? We're just in the state of nature, right? There's no system to guide what we should or shouldn't do. We're only guided by our own sort of desires and drives here. Oops. What does that give us, right? Also, of course, there is limited resources, right? Things are not sort of equally distributed. The morality in the state of nature, this is sort of the second level of morality, right? Which is really a lack of morality, we'll see. We all have a right to all things, right? Everything is mine, but everything is also yours. But because we have a right to all things, we have no duties, right? Rights arise, duties arise when there's a constraint on our duties arise when there's a constraint on our rights. Okay, so for example, right, like I have a right to my property, right? Insofar as you have a duty, right, not to take my property, right? I have a right to not be, physically harmed by you, insofar as you have a duty not to physically harm, right? In the state of nature, right, there are no duties, there are only rights. And so you have no duty not to harm me, you have no duty not to take what I consider to be mine, right? And so in the state of nature, also there's no justice according to Hobbes, because for Hobbes, justice is only doing one's duty. No duty, no justice, right? It's not unjust. There's no lack of justice, but there's also no justice, right? It doesn't exist. The result of all this, according to Hobbes, is that life in the state of nature is a war of all against all, right? We're all just trying to take everyone's stuff. And we'll do that, right? Even if it requires harming other people. So his sort of famous phrase here about the state of nature is life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now remember that we are also rational here, right? So life is short, it's ugly, right? It's difficult. We're always having to kind of watch out because other people might sort of come after us or take what we need to survive, right? So that's sort of going on, but we're also rational, and we realize like that's not the kind of like existence I want to be in. And so it's through the use of our reason as an instrument to get us out of that state that will bring us to the solution, to the social contract. Okay. Right. So self-interested, world of all against all, we are rational. And so what we do is we realize like, oh, well, the way out of that, right, is to allow some sort of check on that right to all things, right? Not because I want to give that up for me, right? Of course, I want to continue to have a right to all things, right? But I realize that the only way I'm going to like, be safe is if I give some of that up, so I can ensure that other people are going to not harm me, right? Not take my stuff or whatever. And so we go through the process, right, of entering into the social contract. Now, what does that look like? What that looks like is that I have to give up my right to all things. And in exchange for that, I get duties. I give them all up to the sovereign, right? My right to all things is given to the sovereign. In exchange, I get duties, right, which is the law. So that's sort of the process that occurs. And so justice arises, and justice is doing one's duty. And so I now have a duty to follow the commands of the sovereign, of the government, right? Again, usually in the form of the law. And then others also have that command, right? And so my life will now be protected. Or at least that's the kind of the idea of entering into the social contract. Let's go right to all things. This results in duties, right? So insofar as we have a right, we have no duty. Insofar as we have a duty, we have no right. So now I have these duties. And this justifies, according to Hobbes, right? This justifies a fairly authoritarian form of government. Right? So long as my life is being protected, right? As long as I have safety and peace, right? That kind of government is justified according to this theory. I retain the right to survival, though, right? And so I get to keep that right, no matter what, right? Like that's the inalienable right according to Hobbes, like because I enter into the social contract for the purpose of survival, right? That's why I enter into it, and so I retain that right. And what that means is that I have a right then for revolt, or collectively we have the right to revolt when our right to survival is no longer being protected by the sovereign, right? And that this can be that the sovereign is in some way directly violating my right to survival, right? Or it can be that the sovereign is too weak, right? And so others are violating my right to survival, right? Or it could be that an external sort of force is sort of coming in, right? That war is occurring or whatever, right? In all those cases, right, it could be that my right to survival is at risk, and so that becomes the limit, right, for the Hobbesian social contract. Okay. Sort of interestingly, Hobbes ends up being censored, and we can think about why that is, right? Why he was censored if what we get is apparent justification for an authoritarian government. And I think it's clear that, like, if you have a different view of rights, you have a different view of human nature, right? You're going to have a different kind of social contract. And so what Hobbes does is he gives us the structure, right? He gives us the machinery of social contract theory. And I think that, I think people kind of recognize that. And we're concerned, right, about this kind of thinking, where it might lead. And I think that in certain ways they were right, in that when we move into other thinkers, they're going to have that different view, right? And they're going to have a very different view of the rights that must be protected, right? So that brings us to John Locke, right? So John Locke, and I think that kind of his sort of approach is probably the most familiar when it comes to our sort of view of governments, right? We see Locke's language showing up in the Declaration of Independence. We see Locke's language showing up in our Constitution. And for Locke, right, we had a perfect liberty to conduct our life as we see fit in the state of nature, right? We have a general freedom from interference by others, right? We don't go around harming other people sort of wantonly, right? The catch here, right, is in terms of property, right? That we don't tend to respect other people's property in the state of nature. Right? We see something that we like of others, or that we need of others, and we're willing to find ways to get that, even if it kind of violates their right to that property. But he considers that to be a right, a God-given right. Right, so life, health, liberty, property. Right, these are sort of his inalienable rights, and again, we see this in our sort of understanding in the Declaration of Independence. Much of that shows up, and so the right to revolt for Locke, right, shows up when those rights are put into question. right? So here we get this sort of discussion of property, the great and chief end thereof, therefore, excuse me, of men uniting into commonwealths, and putting themselves under government, is the preservation of their property, to which in the state of nature there are many things wanting. Right? So we get this sort of Lockean view, and also for Locke, right, morality arises in a much more robust way under the social contract. Right? We become sort of members of this sort of commonwealth, but we get a much more thorough understanding there when we look at Rousseau in just a minute. I just want to point out in the Fifth Amendment why we saw the Declaration of Independence, but also in our Constitution, right, when we think of the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment, we are afforded due process whenever the potential of our life, liberty, or property is being put at risk, right? So that life, liberty, property language that we get from Locke shows up in a fairly clear way in our Constitution. Okay, so I want to mention Rousseau as well. Right? Rousseau has an even more robust view of our rights in the state of nature, where he said that we are largely equal in the state of nature, and life was generally pleasant. And there was a natural liberty that shows up in the state of nature, right? But that's insufficient, right? That sort of natural liberty and that natural sort of cooperation, right? Or not exactly cooperation for Rousseau, right? Because in some ways he's pretty similar to Hobbes here, but our sort of natural kind of desire not to interfere with other people, right? That comes under pressure when we have increase in population and we have kind of resources being put under pressure. So we enter into a social contract, and in the social contract, right, civil liberty arises, right? So this is different than natural liberty. This is civil liberty, and with it, sort of civil virtue and engagement arises. And the sovereign for Rousseau, right, is not some sort of separate sort of individual or body, right? But the sovereign is the embodiment of the will of the people, right? So he has this very strong notion that the sovereign is supposed to sort of further the will of the people. He believes that under governments, right, we will increasingly see inequality arise, and we increasingly see suffering arise. Right, again, he's got that sort of Hobbesian sort of strand within him, where if we were in position of power, right, like that's a significant possibility. And when that happens, right, the justification for result arises. And so for Rousseau, right, like that justification for revolt, the justification for revolt is going to arise much more often. Okay, so returning to the Declaration of Independence, and seeing where these things fit in. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? So we get that with Locke, with Hobbes, and with Rousseau, this notion of equality, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, right? So we've got the rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So Jefferson takes a little shift there, uses this notion of pursuit of happiness. Of course, we can think about what he meant by this notion of pursuit of happiness. Is there sort of a Rousseauian influence on this? But again, to secure these, the purpose of government, right, rights are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Right? So the power of the sovereign comes from consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, so the rights, the people have the right to alter or abolish government and establish a new government, right? And of course, the assumption here is like not that we're going to like sit in anarchy, right? But but a new government will be instituted. Right? So all of these individuals, right, sort of recognize government as an essential aspect of our lives, right? Government is a kind of natural outgrowth of human interaction. And I think that there's sort of notions of the state of nature are in many ways thought experiments. I mean, it's unclear whether any of them believe that we lived in a sort of period of a state of nature. Although I think Hobbes believed that with the English Civil War, right, that we had gotten pretty close. Again, laying its foundations on principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So in all of these, right, at least in terms of sort of social moral principles, right, they arise under the social contract. And it's sort of we as members of that commonwealth or citizens or whatever, right, that those responsibilities, those duties show up, right? So there's a strong connection between morality and the law, right? And at least for Hobbes, right, morality is almost completely grounded in the law, in the social contract, right? Because duty, morality, right, as a social sort of enterprise, right, only shows up within the social contract. So we'll turn next time to looking at natural law and kind of the other side of this, and we can think about, kind of connections and distinctions, right, between these different ways of thinking about law and morality. All right, so that's social contract theory. We'll continue our discussion of law and morality next time. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.